Have you ever been there? We'll try that again. We picking up now, Britt? All right. I was just moving my mouth before. Have you ever been there? It's a question people often ask you, making small talk, trying to get a conversation going. They'll typically proceed then to tell you about how everything's been going poorly in their life and how nothing goes their way. Recently, I feel like I was kind of there. I remember it so vividly because it was just recently. I got up to do some work on the ranch one day. It was frigid cold. So I get up and I bundle up with the necessary amount of clothing, keep the wind off of me, keep the cold off, and was going to go out and do a little bit of welding. I was getting everything ready, and for some reason, I don't typically, but for some reason I was in my grandpa's feed truck. This pickup is a wider than normal pickups, and I was using this little bitty narrow and short welding trailer that we have, and so it's difficult to get the trailer connected to the pickup. I was by myself this morning, and so I was doing the best I could. It took me way longer than necessary and way longer than I'd like to talk about or admit to anyone, especially on the internet, to get a trailer ready to go do some welding. So I take off to weld on some permanent troughs that we were putting in. I get ready. I'm back up to where I need to be, near the troughs. If you don't know welding that well, they got what you call the lead. That's what you weld with. You got the ground, and you connect that so that you can have the power and you can weld. I'm pulling out the lead. I'm pulling out the ground. I only have about 30 feet, maybe 40 feet of each. Get the torch ready because I'm going to do some cutting before I can do my welding. Get them all unrolled, and I backed up to a fence because I had a fence in my way. I threw everything over the fence, got ready, got my helmet on, got my striker. I had everything. I was ready. Hopped over the fence, and I go to pulling it over there so I can get to cutting and welding, and I didn't have enough lead, and I was probably 7 or 8 feet short of being able. And if last time I checked, they didn't have 8-foot welding rods, or else I'd probably had one of them. So I'm getting ready. Everything's ready to go. In order to do that, I'm going to have to throw everything back over the fence and back the pickup up further, to which I was pretty much already on the fence earlier, and I'm angry at this point. I'm cold. I'm getting grouchy because of how long it took to get the trailer ready. And so I just start pushing over the fence because I was just over it. And I back the trailer up on the fence, continue to push it back, stretch the limits. And I go and I test. I'm ready. Everything's ready. I'm there. I'm where I need to be. I'm about to start welding. And so I'm going to do a little bit of cutting first. And I go to strike my torch, and I was out of gas. And so the whole morning was pretty well blown. And luckily it was just in time for lunch. So I cut to go ahead and have a lunch break. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been somewhere that's just that frustrating, that difficult of a morning? And like I said, I know that's a silly example, but we like to talk about that a lot of times. Have you ever been there in a situation that's so difficult, that's so hard? Have you ever been there? Whenever we talk about the Scriptures, whenever we talk about the Bible, we a lot of times will say 2 words: Jesus knows, Jesus understands. And that's definitely true, and I mean to take nothing away from that with our study tonight, but I'm not going to specifically talk directly about Jesus tonight. There's one other character that we see in the Bible that I think we can understand this phrase and study this out a little bit better, and that person is Paul. I suppose if there's one man or woman mentioned in the Scriptures that would understand about struggles, about difficulties, other than Christ, I would think that it has to be Paul. If you ask the question, Paul, have you ever been there? He's probably going to say, yeah, I think I can relate, or something worse than that. In Acts chapter 8 and verse number 3, we see an example of somewhere that Paul was. Before his name was Paul, it says, As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Paul was there. Have you ever been there? I've never been in that situation. I've never been a person who was putting Christians in prison, was fighting, was the opposition of the church and of the Lord's work. But that's somewhere that Paul was. That's a spiritual place that Paul was. He's been to a lot of places, because we see then later on in that book, in Acts chapter 21 there, then Paul answered, "What mean ye to weep and to break mine heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." Paul was there. That's an interesting thing for someone to spiritually and mentally be in both of these places at different times in their life. Paul was there on this end of the spectrum, putting Christians in prison, persecuting the church. And then we have Paul on the other end of the spectrum, being ready to be thrown in jail. Whatever it may be, I am ready to serve the Lord. Paul was there. I suppose if we asked Paul, have you ever been there when you're just having a bad day at work? He would probably laugh. So I want to look at Paul this evening in our study. And I think that we'll find that this study should lead pretty well into our study tomorrow night with Brother Brandon Dukes about the gospel. Beaten, weary, and in pain, Paul was there. In 2 Corinthians, in the 11th chapter, it says, "Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, saved one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, by the heathen, in the city, in the wilderness, in the sea, among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and in nakedness." Paul was there through all of those instances. There he was. This is a place that Paul was physically. I hope that you're never in these places, but these were places that Paul was at. Let me tell you, if there's anybody other than Jesus Christ in the Scriptures that you could ask and say, "Hey, have you ever been there?" I think it would probably be Paul. And so I want to make just a few points about Paul tonight. Paul was there standing by in the 7th chapter of Acts. It says there in the 51st verse, "Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ye do always resist the Holy Ghost, as your fathers did, so do ye. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them which showed before the coming of the just one, of whom ye have been now the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have kept it not. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart." Now this has been Stephen speaking. "And they gnashed on him with their teeth. But he, being full of the Holy Ghost, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and said, Behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. Then they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord, and cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their coats at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul, and they stoned Stephen." There was a young man, Saul, the young Paul, standing by as a Christian was killed, standing by as a man who desired to serve God, standing by as a man who wanted to please God, was killed, was stoned. And I can see Saul. I can see Saul standing there holding the coats of those other people. I can see him, a young man. You know, we don't know much about Saul at this point, but we do know he's a young man. Let's go to the first verse of the next chapter, which is the following verse there to verse number 59. And we find out just a little bit more. It says, "And Saul was consenting unto his death. And at that time, there was a great persecution against the church. We don't know much about Saul. We know a little about this situation here. I don't know how, but we do know that the decision was made at some point by someone that Stephen would be stoned. So place yourself, if you will, in the shoes of a young Saul standing by. Place yourself at this young man's in his position as he stands by to sin, as he stands by to opposition of the Lord's church. You know, I don't know much about Saul, as we've said before, but as a young man, I have to assume that this was a violent act, if nothing less. This was an incredibly violent thing that happened in front of this young man. I don't know how young he was, but we have to imagine the people that he was around as well. I'm assuming that he wasn't with strangers. I'm assuming that he was with people he would consider friends, with people that he might consider family, with people that he would look at as someone that he looks up to. You know, he was confused. And now to relate that back to our lives quickly, we've done the same things. I would ask you, have you ever been there where you're standing by to sin, where you're standing by to something that God would definitely oppose of? I've been there. Have you ever been there where you're standing by to sin? You know, it's a place that Paul was at spiritually at a time when he was unlearned and when he was unknowing, and he stood by there to sin and watched as a Christian was mercilessly killed. You know, there's no gray area with sin. There's no gray area with our God. Sin is either up or it's down, it's in or it's out. It's one way or the other. There's no gray area with sin. And I suppose that for Saul there, standing by and not only just holding the coats of those that stoned Stephen, but also to consent to his death, I suppose that Saul might as well have just picked up a rock and thrown it himself. Let me tell you, have you ever been there standing by as the people, as your friends, as your family around you would commit sin that you wouldn't agree with, but you give your consent and you stand by there knowing fully well that it's not the right thing, that it's not what God would want you to do? I've been there, and so was Paul. You know, the issue is that Paul didn't always stand by to sin. Just 2 verses later, in the 8th chapter of Acts, it says, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison." The verse we read just a few minutes ago. Saul didn't always stand by to sin. You see, that evolved into something much worse, something much different. You know, I don't know the time frame that would go on between a first and third verse of Acts chapter 8, but I'm assuming it couldn't have been much time here between these 2 verses. But regardless of that point, we know that it probably wasn't that long from the young Saul who's standing there and holding on to the coats of those that stoned Stephen before he is the one, before he is the man that's putting Christians in prison, before he is the man that's opposing the Lord's church. How did Saul get here? How did he get to this point? You know, we have to go back and think then again about the people that he was with, the upbringing that he had to get to that point. But I think that if we'll be honest with ourselves, we'll find that it could be a little bit more similar to our own lives than we think. That most likely a young Saul would have seen Stephen being stoned as a violent act, as a horrible thing, regardless of his beliefs. And with time, and with that happening, and probably other occasions and in different scenarios, I suppose that Saul probably became numb to that, probably started to agree with that, started to look up to people who would do that. And next thing you know, he's not just standing by to sin. He is the sinner. And he is the one there. Instead of holding a coat, rather, he's the one there throwing the rock at Stephen. Have you ever been there? Because I know I have. Finding that the sin that you once stood by to, that you didn't consent to, that you knew was wrong, but you were willing to stand by and let other people do it, and that slowly creeps into consenting to that sin, and the next thing you know, you're wrapped up in that sin. Have you ever been there? I've been there. That's a place that Paul was spiritually, and it's a place that, if we'll be honest with ourselves, I think we've been spiritually. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, we find another place where Paul was later in his life, or at that time in his life. It says there, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief." Chief of sinners, the worst of the worst, Paul says. Paul was there. Have you ever been there? The chief of sinners. I tell you, folks, I've been there as well. It says in Isaiah chapter 59, "For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies, your tongue hath muttered perverseness. None calleth for justice, nor any pleadeth for truth. They trust in vanity, speak lies, conceive mischief, bring forth iniquity." Have you ever been there? The chief of sinners. The person that when God looks down, He sees somebody, hands covered in blood, full of iniquity. He can't even look at you. Full of perverseness. Full of unrighteousness. Have you ever been there? Paul was there, and I've been there. In a place where I know that when God looked down, if He saw me, He would see someone covered in blood, defiled, and hands just full of iniquity. It's a place that I've been. It's a place where many of us have been in our lives, if we'll be honest with ourselves. But Paul was there as well. We know that Paul started out in what would seem like to some people an excuse of just standing by as a young man. Next thing, he's consenting to sin. Next thing you know, he's the one performing sin publicly. Next thing you know, he's calling himself the chief of sinners. And I know this was later in his life. But I want to read about one more instance in Paul's life. One that would make an enormous and a very needed change for him. And that's in Acts chapter 9. And I think you probably know where I'm going. Saul was there. Through all the other instances we've talked at, and now here in Acts chapter 9, Saul's here, Paul is here, confronted in sin. The man there, the chief of sinners, hands full of iniquity, covered in blood. Here he is. In verse number 3, "And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. Here he is, confronted in sin. Have you ever been there, confronted in sin? I know I've been there. I've sat here in this church building, confronted in my sin by the Word of God, confronted in my sin by a brother or a sister. But once again, place yourself in the shoes of Saul here. Back there, and it's in that first slide, in verse number 3, he's there, falling to the ground when Jesus in the light hits him straight in the face. Imagine there, confronted in your sin by Jesus himself. Confronted to the point of falling to the ground. I've been there. Confronted in my own sin. You see, Saul here has decisions to be made. He realizes that this is Jesus. He realizes that this is an authority figure. He respects the authority that Jesus has. He calls him Lord. And he knows that he's been caught red-handed. He knows now that Everything he's done in his life up to this point has been a sham, and that it's been wrong. And then he knows that Jesus looks down on him and sees a man covered and defiled in blood, hands full of iniquity and unrighteousness. So, what happens next? Paul has a reaction that you and I desperately need to have as well whenever we are confronted in sin, because we've been there. And you probably can recognize with some of the feelings that Saul had at this moment. It's very clear that Saul at this point is desperate for the answer. Reading back over there in verse number 3, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. And suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the prick. And Saul is desperate, and he trembling and astonished. Imagine what's going through the mind of Saul at this time. Falling to the ground, trembling and astonished. I imagine him crying and weeping and realizing in a moment the mistakes that he's made. Realizing in a moment the gravity of the situation that he's in. Realizing in that moment who he's speaking to and who has just confronted him in his sins. And he, trembling and astonished, Saul was desperate. He was as desperate as anybody can get in that moment. Have you ever been there? I've been there. Desperate. Absolutely desperate for an answer. Desperate for intervention from Jesus himself. Desperate for him to come in and wash me. But you see, that's not enough just to be desperate, because Saul then asks the most important question he'd ever asked in his life. Continuing on there, and he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? What will you have me to do? I understand. I realize who you are. I realize the authority that you have. I realize what I've done, the sins I've committed. I wonder if he thought back to Stephen and realized the mistakes he made from the young age up till now. And he asks an incredible question. What will you have me to do? You know, we read some other instances in the book of Acts in the 2nd chapter here that remind me a lot of Saul here on the road to Damascus. In the 36th verse of Acts chapter 2, Peter here preaching, Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus, whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. Desperate for the answer, the people here that crucified the Son of God. Now when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart. Does that sound like anybody that we just read about? Desperate for the answer. I believe we know what happens in verse number 28. But that wasn't enough just to be pricked in the heart. In verse 37 there, in the latter part, now when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart and said unto Peter and the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? The most important question that they could ever ask. Let me tell you, have you ever been there? Asking those questions? I've been there. Desperate for the answer. Having been confronted in sin, needing to ask the questions that they asked here in Acts chapter 2, the same questions that Saul asked to Jesus himself. What shall we do? What can we do? Because we realize now the gravity of our mistakes. Folks, we can learn a lot from the places that Paul has been. Mostly we can learn a lot from the places he's been spiritually, standing by to sin, from the places he's been consenting to sin, the places that he's been committing the sin, the places he's been the chief of sinners, the places that he's been confronted in sin, desperate for the answer, and asking the right questions to the right people. Folks, you are on the road to Damascus tonight. We're faced with the same decisions that Saul made tonight. And we can choose the same things that Saul chose, or we can choose a different option. We can ask those questions and we can find out the answers, or we can turn around and we can be content in our sin. So put yourself there in the shoes of Paul one more time. After he's been confronted in sin, after he's desperate for the answer, after he's asked the right questions, put yourself in his shoes once more. We know that he would go on to soon obey Christ. He had a good and he had an honest heart in doing that. But think for just a moment about some of the excuses that Saul could have made. Excuses are never any good. We try to make excuses all the time. And I suppose if anybody had an excuse, maybe it was Saul. And I don't even like that then. But these are some of the excuses that we try to make in a little bit different way. You know, Jesus could have told Saul what he needed to do there later on in that chapter that we're not going to read tonight. And Saul could have been confronted, could have been desperate, could have been asking the right questions. And he could have said, I don't know, I'm kind of busy right now. I'm kind of in the middle of something. I've got people here that are relying on me. It's got a little bit too much going on. Does that sound like an excuse we make? He could have said, that sounds like a good deal. I need to do that, but today's really just not a great day. Sounds like an excuse I've heard before. Some others, what will my peers think? This is one that could have been anywhere close to valid for Saul, if no one else. What are the people that I grew up with going to think? The people that sent me here in the first place, my family, my friends. What are they going to think about me if they know the life that I've chosen now to serve Christ, to obey Christ after the life that I've lived these last years? Better yet, what will other Christians think? Other Christians knew who Saul was. They knew what he did. They knew what he was capable of. What if he sees one of them walking down the road, bumps into them at the grocery store? What are they going to think about this man? Are they going to think that he's really a Christian? He could have thought about all these things and none of them would have been valid. We can come up with the same or similar excuses in our own life. We make excuses not to get right with God day after day. But the fact is, if they weren't good enough for Paul, they're not good enough for any of us either. You're on the road to Damascus tonight, and I encourage you, and I plead with you to look for the answers, to ask the right questions. There's one more place that Saul was, a place that we all need to be. I mentioned at the beginning that Saul's been on both ends of the spectrum, and we're going to close with 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse number 6. For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. This is where I want to be. Have you ever been there? Are you there? Are you there tonight? Because Paul, at a time in his life, was able to say that with the utmost certainty. Have you ever been there? Let me tell you, that's a place that I want to be. I want to be in that place. I want to be there on the day of judgment. And whenever we enter into our reward, I want to be there, and I want to have that crown of righteousness placed on my head. And I believe that when we look over, there's going to be Paul. Paul's been there, and Paul will be there. And I'm confident in that. Folks, if there's any need that you have for the church, we encourage you to reach out to us through a Facebook or a cell phone number. And if there's any need that you have, we'd love to help you with that. I think that this is a good place to stop for our study tonight. Brother Brandon's going to pick up with the gospel tomorrow night. God bless you. Thank you for listening.
We thank you, Zane. Again, we thank you for joining us tonight. If you have any questions, leave a comment in Messenger or in the comment section. We'll be more than happy to assist you in that manner. or with any other topic that has been broadcasted, just let us know. Don't hesitate to ask, no matter what your need is. We hope you all have a wonderful evening and a good night. If there's any way that we can possibly help you, let us know. We ask you to continue to pray for the situation at hand, for those that are in the medical field, those that are sick and hurting, those that are shut in, and those that have lost their jobs due to the economic situation. We pray that you would remember them in your prayers. We hope you all have a good night.